They called it invisible death. No wake, no warning. Just an eruption of fire and a column of steam where a ship had been. To Allied sailors in 1942 it was pure terror. Sonar found nothing. Lookouts saw nothing. Yet steel kept tearing open under the sea. The weapon responsible wasn't a mine or a submarine ambush. It was something the world had never seen before. Faster, farther, and deadlier than anything built in the West. It was Japan's secret superweapon, the Type 93 Long Lance. And before the Allies could even name it, it had already rewritten the rules of war. At Savo Island, August 1942, 8 Allied cruisers were crippled in minutes. At Tassafaronga, a single Japanese salvo destroyed 4 heavy ships. To Allied commanders it seemed sorcery, a secret weapon that defied counterattack. No one knew how it worked or why it was so lethal. Invisible death, one survivor called it. But as the war dragged on, something began to change. Reports from the front lines painted a new picture. Japanese torpedoes were suddenly misfiring, running too deep or exploding prematurely. Some ships escaped what should have been certain destruction. The invincible weapon was faltering. That mystery drew the attention of a new kind of warrior, engineers. At Pearl Harbor's Naval Ammunition Depot, salvage crews retrieved unexploded long lances embedded in coral and sand. The weapons were dismantled under armed guard, each part laid out under harsh fluorescent lights. Brass valves, flawless welds, and strange oxygen chambers hinted at an engineering masterpiece. Yet when the data was compared to battlefield records, nothing made sense. How could the same design yield both perfection and failure? The question became an obsession. Somewhere between the first flawless models of 1942 and the unstable, self-destructive weapons of 1944, something fundamental had changed. Was it sabotage, design decay, or the slow starvation of a nation at war? To the American engineers hunched over the torpedo's disassembled body, this was more than a technical riddle. It was a window into the enemy's mind. The blend of daring and desperation that had driven Japan's naval supremacy. They could see it in the craftsmanship, the hand-polished bearings, the elegant propellers balanced to microscopic precision. But they could also see the limits. Components corroded by salt, alloys weakened by impurities. Each fragment seemed to whisper the same paradox. Brilliance turned brittle, precision turned peril. The empire that had once terrified the seas was now sabotaged by its own ingenuity. As one engineer later recalled, it was like dissecting a myth. And deep within that myth, they were about to uncover a truth far more unsettling. The weapon's greatest strength had also been its doom. A decade before those fragments reached American hands, the story had begun in quiet shipyards along Japan's inland sea. The year was 1930. The Treaty of Washington had limited Japan's battleships, but not its imagination. Naval strategists like Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and engineers at the Kure Naval Arsenal conceived a weapon to compensate for numerical inferiority, a torpedo so advanced it could rewrite the logic of naval warfare. The plan was revolutionary. Instead of using compressed air, which left a telltale bubble trail, engineers experimented with pure oxygen as an oxidizer. Oxygen burned hotter, longer, and cleaner, producing no visible trace. But it was volatile. Even a spark could turn a submarine into a coffin. To control that danger, they built intricate regulators and triple-sealed valves that could release the gas in precise increments. The result was a torpedo 30 feet long, weighing nearly 3 tons, carrying a massive 200-pound warhead of Type 97 explosive. Trials at Lake Ogura in 1933 astonished even the inventors. The Type 93 ran at nearly 50 knots, faster than any destroyer in the world, and reached distances over 20,000 yards. The Imperial Navy immediately classified it top secret. Crew training manuals omitted its full specifications. Only select destroyer captains were briefed on its use, sworn to silence under penalty of court-martial. By 1941, As the Pacific War ignited, Japan's fleet carried hundreds of these weapons. At Savo Island, they struck unseen in the blackness. Torpedoes fired from beyond visual range, tearing through steel hulls like paper. The long lance turned night into nightmare. Allied warships burned in the tropical dark, and rumors spread through every wardroom. Japan had invented the perfect weapon, but perfection has a cost. The Type 93's performance depended on oxygen purity near 100%, maintained in delicate steel cylinders that required constant inspection. Crews needed to flush each chamber, check seals, and polish valves daily. As the war expanded, those rituals eroded. The oxygen supply became contaminated. Maintenance crews were rushed, overworked, or dead. Factories replaced skilled artisans with untrained laborers. By 1943, cracks appeared in Japan's invincibility. Long lances began failing in battle, their exquisite precision undone by dirt, haste, and shortage. Yet even then, Allied forces underestimated how far Japan had once gone, how close it had come to technical dominance. The long lance was more than a torpedo. It was a symbol of the Empire's belief that genius could overcome numbers. And as the Americans recovered the wreckage, they were not merely studying steel. They were reading the Empire's diary written in oxygen and flame. Every piece of history we uncover brings the past a little closer. If you'd like to keep exploring these hidden moments with us, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. Your support keeps these stories alive. The crates arrived at Mare Island in early 1943. They smelled of seawater and decay, fragments of a weapon that had once terrified fleets. Commander R.L. Werner's engineering team unpacked each piece carefully. Bolts and bearings were cleaned, tagged, and photographed. It was forensic work, the anatomy of power. They expected a standard torpedo, air flask, fuel chamber, gyro. What they found instead was alien. There were no air tanks, no compressed gas outlets. In their place, a network of copper piping and an oxygen control valve shaped like a small teapot. It fed pure oxygen directly into the combustion chamber. One slip, one spark, and the entire device could vaporize its crew. Yet the Japanese had somehow mastered the impossible balance between fire and pressure. As the engineers rebuilt the sections, admiration turned to unease. The machining tolerances were so fine that even American lathes struggled to replicate them. Bearings rolled smooth as glass. The propellers were hand-polished to mirror finish. But on later examples, and those recovered from wrecks near the Solomons, the quality had fallen apart. The welds were rough, the steel discolored. Metallurgical tests confirmed cheaper alloys, probably due to dwindling resources. Charts on the lab wall showed a disturbing pattern. The earliest torpedoes, from 1941 and 1942, had flawless performance, but by late 1943 failures skyrocketed. Premature detonations, erratic courses, oxygen leaks. The data aligned perfectly with intelligence reports of Japan's resource collapse under Allied blockade. Every scratch and imperfection told a story. The engineers realized they were watching an empire's decline written in metal. Perfection, once routine, had become unsustainable. The very brilliance of the Type 93 demanded a precision Japan could no longer afford. In one test, a partially restored specimen exploded during fueling. The cause: a drop of oil contaminating the oxygen line. The explosion blew out the test shed's roof. That was when the Americans understood just how fragile the long lance truly was. Its power depended on purity beyond human reliability. As Commander Werner's report concluded, it is a masterpiece of engineering, and madness. In the quiet that followed, the engineers stood before the disassembled torpedo, surrounded by the scent of oil and scorched metal. The weapon's story was laid bare, a triumph so precise it could no longer survive the chaos of war. They understood then that the long lance had not simply failed, it had consumed itself, undone by the very perfection that once made it feared. The silence in the lab was heavy, almost reverent, as if they were standing over the relic of a vanished empire. What lay before them was more than a machine. It was a mirror reflecting the fatal ambition of those who had built it. By late 1944, the sea no longer belonged to Japan. At Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Navy launched its last desperate counterattack, and with it the final storm of long lances. Hundreds were fired across the dark water, streaking toward the massive American invasion fleet. But this time the ocean stayed silent. Most missed. Some exploded prematurely. Others sank without detonation. In the glow of tracer fire, American radar officers watched the blips vanish harmlessly. The terror that once haunted them was gone. The perfect weapon had become unreliable. Captured logs from the destroyer Shimakaze told a grim story. Oxygen leaks had turned the torpedo rooms into death traps. Replacement gyroscopes made from soft wartime steel jammed mid-run. Crewmen, lacking alcohol for cleaning, used improvised rags soaked in fuel, contaminating the regulators. The Long Lance's precision engineering had turned into an albatross around the Navy's neck. Sailors feared it more than they trusted it. Meanwhile, at American proving grounds in Newport and Pearl Harbor, captured examples were being test-fired. The first launch produced spectacular results, a 48-knot run, clean and silent. But on the second test, the torpedo veered erratically, struck the tank wall and exploded. Investigators traced the fault to oxygen instability. The weapon that once symbolized Japan's technological edge had become proof of its collapse. By then, American destroyers were equipped with advanced radar and sonar, giving them eyes that no longer relied on daylight or luck. Air superiority and submarine blockades crippled Japanese logistics. The Empire's engineers, once artisans, were now desperate improvisers. Every test, every recovered weapon told the same story. Japan's perfectionist doctrine was unsustainable in total war. In the sterile glow of laboratory lights, the Americans saw not just the failure of a machine, but the exhaustion of an idea. And still, they wanted to understand more. They wanted to look inside the beating heart of this weapon, to witness the exact moment where control surrendered to chaos. That pursuit would take them to the edge of detonation itself, and to the revelation that brilliance, when unrestrained, carries the seed of its own destruction. When the captured torpedo finally roared to life, the Pacific air itself seemed to tremble. At Pearl Harbor's Naval Ammunition Depot in the summer of 1944, a team led by Commander R.L. Werner prepared for the most dangerous experiment of their careers, a full live test of a Japanese Type 93. Heavy blast walls surrounded the pit. Technicians in flame-proof suits crouched behind armored glass. Oxygen hoses coiled like serpents across the floor. A red light blinked on. The order came. Ignite. The detonation chamber erupted with sound, but a thunderous metallic howl, the shriek of combustion so fierce it blurred the air. White exhaust blasted from the propellers, spraying a ghostly mist over the test bay. The sensors went wild. 48 knots of thrust, perfect balance, flawless acceleration. But 10 seconds later, the readings trembled. Pressure in the oxygen manifold spiked, then collapsed. The torpedo wavered off course and struck the retaining wall, stopping just short of catastrophe. The team froze, hearts hammering. They had seen the weapon's dual nature, beauty and peril bound together. Subsequent tests confirmed the cause. A microscopic trace of oil inside the oxygen feed had triggered unstable combustion. The Long Lance demanded laboratory purity that no warship on the open sea could possibly maintain. One misstep, one impurity, and the line between propulsion and explosion vanished. When the smoke cleared, the engineers sat in silence. Commander Werner compared the results with runs from the American Mark 15, slower, clumsier, but predictable. The contrast was philosophical. The Mark 15 embodied industrial repetition. The Long Lance embodied artistic obsession. One was designed to be built by thousands of hands, the other by a handful of masters. The realization carried weight beyond the workshop. Japan's technological miracle had become a metaphor for its war. Extraordinary innovation undone by impossible standards. Even perfection, it seemed, could be a liability when stretched across the chaos of global conflict. That night, as the oxygen fumes dissipated over Pearl Harbor, Werner wrote in his logbook, "They reached for control over nature itself, and nature bit back." The next morning, he ordered another firing. Understanding demanded repetition, and repetition meant risk. Each test would take them closer to the truth that haunted both sides of the Pacific, that the line between genius and hubris is measured in thousandths of an inch, and one breath of oxygen too pure. By 1945, Japan's laboratory still sketched wonders that would never leave the page. In the tunnels beneath Yokosuka and Kure, engineers drafted blueprints for electric torpedoes, miniature homing devices, even jet-powered submarines. Yet the cities above them burned. Steel was rationed by the ounce. Copper wire came from melted church bells. Oxygen production plants lay in ruins. The men drawing miracles did so by candlelight, their instruments blackened with soot. Across the ocean, America had transformed warfare into industry. In Michigan and Connecticut, torpedo factories ran 24 hours a day. Every part was standardized, every worker trained to assemble by rote. The Mark 18 electric torpedo rolled off lines by the thousands, slower than Japan's Long Lance, but cheap, safe, and consistent. The contrast defined the new world, mass reliability defeating bespoke perfection. After Japan's surrender, American ordnance officers walked through the remnants of the Kure Naval Arsenal. They found shelves of oxygen regulators, rows of incomplete Type 93 casings, and notebooks filled with elegant equations, all testament to minds that had refused to compromise even as the nation starved. One engineer's margin note read, "No substitute for purity." It might as well have been the empire's epitaph. In 1946, the Bureau of Ordnance published a quiet but decisive report titled Lessons in Enemy Ordnance Design. Its conclusion was blunt. Perfection must yield to practicality. That single sentence reshaped post-war engineering doctrine. It echoed through naval academies and design bureaus for decades, a credo that favored maintainability over mastery, endurance over elegance. To the Americans who had once feared the Long Lance, it became an object of admiration tinged with warning. They displayed a recovered specimen at Newport with a placard that read simply, "Type 93, the finest torpedo of its age." Beneath that plaque, a smaller line added, "and the most unforgiving." The fall of the Long Lance mirrored the fall of its empire. A superlative weapon built by men who demanded flawlessness from a world that could no longer supply it. The engineers who studied its remains understood that truth intimately. War rewards not the perfect, but the persistent. The final test at Mare Island took place on a gray February morning. The rain drummed on the corrugated roof as technicians slid the torpedo into the proving tank. One last run to close the file marked Type 93 Japanese. They checked every valve, polished the propeller blades until they caught the light like mirrors, and sealed the oxygen feed. When the ignition signal came, the Long Lance leapt forward. Water foamed behind it, the gyro held true, the thrust line perfect. Across the 600-foot tank it ran arrow straight, flawless. And yet, as the torpedo struck the far wall and settled silently to the bottom, no one cheered. The perfection they had witnessed felt less like triumph and more like requiem. Here finally was the weapon as its creators had imagined it. Precise, obedient, beautiful, and utterly obsolete. The final report was written in language more philosophical than technical. "Technology," the summary read, "cannot exceed the endurance of the system that builds it." Those words traveled farther than the torpedo itself. They appeared later in lectures at Annapolis and papers at MIT, even in Cold War design policy. From them emerged a new doctrine, reliability as a form of strategy. Decades later, surviving engineers recalled that moment. One wrote privately, "We realized we weren't just testing metal, we were testing an idea, that brilliance alone can win a war. It cannot." In the quiet that followed, the test bay seemed almost like a shrine. The men who had dissected their enemy's greatest weapon now regarded it with reverence. They had dismantled its mystery, but in doing so, uncovered something human. The universal urge to reach further than one's means allow. When the lights went out and the bay doors closed, the last gleam on the water faded. The Long Lance had run its final course. Its legacy would move not through oceans, but through the minds of those who built the weapons of tomorrow. A silent reminder that even perfection has a shelf life. After the guns fell silent, the Pacific kept its secrets. Beneath calm blue horizons lay a graveyard of steel, the remains of fleets, aircraft, and torpedoes scattered from Truk Lagoon to the Philippines. Among them rested hundreds of Type 93s, their sleek bodies fused to coral, their engines filled with sand. Divers who ventured down decades later found them eerily preserved. Propellers frozen mid-turn, guidance fins intact, oxygen valves rusted but still recognizable. Time had transformed them from weapons into artifacts. In 1950, a new era dawned. American and Japanese engineers, now colleagues in research rather than enemies in war, gathered at technical conferences in Tokyo and Washington. Together they studied the Long Lance's blueprints and fragments. They traced the welds, examined the valve assemblies, and spoke openly of lessons learned at unimaginable cost. For the Japanese, it was a confrontation with lost brilliance. For the Americans, a mirror held up to their own industrial creed. Both sides recognized the same truth. Innovation without sustainability is a dead end. The torpedo's influence quietly endured. Modern designs adopted safer propellants like hydrogen peroxide and steam cycle systems, abandoning pure oxygen forever. Modular construction replaced artisanal assembly. Naval warfare entered an age of systems engineering, where reliability became the supreme virtue. The ghost of the Long Lance lingered in every design review, every checklist, every line of cautionary text in a manual. Today, in museums from Pearl Harbor to Yokosuka, a handful of preserved Type 93s gleam under fluorescent lights. Children peer into their open casings. Veterans stand silently beside them. Few notice the inscription etched onto one display tag: "Perfection undone by the sea." Beneath the waves, others remain untouched. Their casings lie half buried in sand, home to coral and fish. The ocean hums softly above them, a natural requiem for a machine that once redefined fear. In their silence lives the final lesson of the Pacific War, that the pursuit of mastery, when severed from endurance, leads inevitably to rust. The Long Lance sleeps on, a masterpiece turned memorial, its brilliance preserved not in victory but in memory. A reminder that even the most perfect weapon cannot outlast the imperfect hands that made it. If you've made it this far, you're one of us, searching for the truth behind the headlines and the courage behind the silence. Subscribe to the channel, and let's keep exploring the hidden wars, secret operations, and untold fates that shape the world we live in.